We don't, they don't believe in depression. Um, I think it's mostly frowned upon. I don't even, yeah, my grandma had depression. I'd never heard of it until my grandfather died, and then my cousins warned me that I should be more sensitive around her, especially after my grandfather's death, because she had breakdowns before. It was something I never knew about. Um, Mental health wasn't really a topic back there. Like, you're supposed to be happy or be strong enough. Like, if you had depression, that just meant you weren't strong enough to go through it. Um, they see it more as character building instead of soul crushing.
He appears on the border chosen, near the border posted. Hear the offer, clear the orders, here the floor we coasted. Cabernet from 94, beer to pour from another ocean. You cats posing with the sword of omens. Twist foliage.
Welcome to Strong Enough, the podcast exploring the minds of millennials of color and how they go about the world. I'm Olivia Ashton, your host.
You see the artist is a vessel for that cosmic signal. We translate the program, concept simple. Dance along ecliptic, prance around the world, take the form of mystic and dress realistic.
You're supposed to be happy or be strong enough. That was Maria, a 25-year-old Filipina. Her family immigrated to the U.S. when she was just 14. I interviewed her 2 years ago as a part of an audio documentary I was making as an undergrad. The inspiration for it came from a conversation I had with two friends of mine, both of different racial backgrounds. We were joking about our childhoods, and we found out that our entire life story followed an eerily similar plot. Our parents started from nothing, and after years of hard work and sacrifice, they were able to afford us, their kids, with a safe middle-class lifestyle. More accurately, this can be described as, what do you mean you're hungry? You don't know what hunger is kind of lifestyle. Meanwhile, we had to learn how to navigate predominantly white spaces with more wealth and stability than our own households, while also navigating the spaces of our extended families and family friends, many of whom were still more or less struggling in a cycle of poverty or living in impoverished areas. We felt pressure to achieve in white spaces while remaining down, quote unquote, authentically ourselves with our community and the struggle at large. Basically, we got real used to being told we sounded ghetto or foreign to our peers and white to our cousins. So I decided I wanted my project to focus on the socioeconomic backgrounds of young people of color and how race and class became effective forces on their lives. I should have known then just how colossal this project would be, but I was convinced at the time that I could make this a 10-minute audio doc. In all the interviews with my subjects, despite asking them questions mostly about family, money, the American dream, the conversation always led back to their personal mental health and wellness. My friend and former classmate Javi, a 23-year-old Chicano, talked about the stigma of mental illness in communities of color and how it prevented him from recognizing the signs of depression and anxiety in his own life. What is the source of that stigma with communities of color? That mental health, depression, all of that's something that's too taboo or it's met with hostility?
I think, I mean, I was born here, both my parents weren't, but I think a lot of that came, the like stigma of like mental health and mental health in communities of color definitely comes, one, from the media, because that's the media and like, yeah, actual news to what we see. We really, when we think of like mental health and depression and anxiety, we usually just think like white people or in general Western culture, what's Western culture problem, but which is unfortunate because I think actually for me, and I've been in the process of figuring out my own, issues with anxiety and depression. I actually think I did not know what anxiety or depression was. Like, I think I felt both of them at a very young age, a very young age. And that all had to do with, you know, not being out, figuring out, you know, how people viewed me, and it had to do with a lot of different things. But I think I felt all the emotions, but I had no name for them. I knew what anxiety and depression were, but it didn't connect. I always thought that those two terms had to come with this sort of over the top, you know, obvious side effects that I was like, oh, I can't really have those things. Like, that's, you know, for, I don't know. I just never thought of myself as experiencing those things, even though I definitely was.
We so often talk about the circumstances surrounding people of color without ever really diving into individual psyches. We know people of color face systemic struggles, and we all love those rags to riches stories where people of color achieve the American dream in spite of, or those black magic inspirational stories where some kid was able to achieve something in a traditionally white space. We ask about their childhood, we ask about the come up, but we rarely ask the simplest question: are you okay? Because being a person of color means always being aware that others will see the worst in you or the best in you for the same dehumanizing reasons. So, how do young people of color understand their place in the world without buying into it?
A lot of people have looked at me, even a lot of, I should say, white people have looked at me like, oh, he's a black person of like something, you know, like I have something. Um, and then when they find out that like I grew up like in the projects, like off of welfare, they're like, really? You don't look like that. I'm like, people don't like aren't supposed to like have like a sign that says, hey, I'm a WIC baby. I'm a food stamps baby, you know, like I grew up in subsidized housing. Like, I don't think that's a look.
People just like perceive brown bodies as just like not having any worth, like subconsciously, and also like especially brown bodies that aren't like capable of being sexualized. So like when I first came, I was just like really awkward and like ugly. I think that because I didn't have value in the eyes of like white men or white women, like white men couldn't find me like sexually attractive, and like white women couldn't relate to me on like the level of like, oh, let's be best friends and like join sororities and stuff like that and like go to frat parties, because obviously I just look foreign as fuck. I look like I didn't know what I was doing. Sorry, can I swear?
That's fine.
Okay. So I think it was honestly more of like being invisible than even people projecting like certain stereotypes on me. So that was like the biggest problem for me.
That's the other minefield we experience. People of color can be invisible and on display simultaneously. We can be barely represented in federal government and yet still be blamed for our problems as a nation. We can be just one brown face in an all-white classroom and still be called upon to speak for our entire race. I mean, we can be incompetent and yet always looked at as someone constantly scheming some evil or criminal plan. How do young people of color begin to recognize this fallacy?
It was like they just assumed I had less or knew less because of the way I looked. Or like when I would go to like Wicker Park with my friends in high school, I would always get followed around in stores more. And I think it's just like they probably weren't used to black kids being in Wicker Park, but it was also, I mean, they just assumed I was going to steal. But I think most of the time when people saw me, they would, either assume I was going to take something or I didn't know something. So I think that kind of gave me kind of this like resistant feeling towards like authority or like white people, basically.
That may be the most interesting question of all. How do young people of color understand whiteness before they even fully understand their own experience?
But for me personally, I think my views are a little bit more, I guess you can say, radical compared to my mom and that family. And I think that all came from just having multiple marginalized identities that I forget who said that, like, the lower you are on the totem pole, the clearer you see, like, the foundation of, like, what's messed up about society. So yeah, the more I like found out more about my own different identities and how they're not like just their own individual ones, that they all sort of intersect, being queer, being Latino, being lower middle class, being a male, and how all of those different identities sort of, they're not separate from each other. They all make up who I am and how I view the world and how things are. So the top of the top, in terms of privilege, we think of is he looks like a man, white man, heterosexual, male, upper middle class. So all the marginalized identities that don't align with that, whether you're a woman of color, a queer woman of color, so the lower you go down on this totem pole in marginalized identities, I feel like the clearer you are able to not only see but understand how those above you, quote unquote, act, how they see things, almost because you have to. If you are a person of color living in the U.S., you know what, like, white media, what, a lot of your white peers sort of think of you, perceive you. So I think it's actually kind of powerful, because you have this sort of like supervision almost, and view perspective on society.
Water down into a coffin pan, boss's plan. Keep them updates and substrates of toxic glam. I drop a gem, cause jaded I often am. That's why Stinks is not the chattering type. I'm quick to say peace and move on to dazzling heights. Leave the haters at the gate, they not traveling right. Don't show flair, can't compare to its battering bites. It's polysyllabic, multi-dynamic, capturing sight. Slightly mechanic, running with panic, rapture and dight. Lightly go tantric, almighty show antic.
At Radical Colors, our team bridges the gap between reactive feeling and educational discourse. Strong Enough centers on mental health and how race, gender, sexuality, and certain generational differences affect how millennials of color go about the world. We'd like to give our sincere thanks to Maria and Javi for sharing their story with us, and we look forward to sharing more with y'all very soon. We'd also like to give a special thank you to Fringe Character for letting us use their joint, Sort of Almonds, off their latest album, Mint. You can find more tracks and their performance schedule at fringecharacter.com. That's FRINGE character.com. Next time, we'll be talking about geography and how the places people of color live and what they have access to reflect the politics of that area. What places do you call home? What places do you wish you could call home? If you'd like to share your story with Strong Enough, please email us at radicalpoc@gmail.com. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter at radical_colors. Until the next episode, take care.
Flexing with my wand out, trying to smash a muggle. Roll that piff, I'm off that lick. Spit that shit that gets y'all lit. I probably hit if Hermione was thick, but a skinny ass just ain't legit. Solemnly swear that I ain't up to shit. Peep game when you talk to the six. Place bets when I'm rocking the sticks. I sip gin with a thieving legit. Get on my level, little devil, and we both get rich. We'll make the whole block bump like an 8.6. Got that lean back flow like I know how to mix. Stupid slow delivery like you shopping at Kith. Yo, day, how long you been this sick? Time flies, polarized, fortified with the illness. A lot of cushion, concentration to kill this. The metamorphosize and energize with the realness. Daily Yoda moonwalk, musical ceilings. Like Stinks fam, we out this